Friday the 13th of August 1993, we were at the scene of that momentous conflict that happened 117 years ago. Our first look at Last Stand Hill. To the right, down by the cottonwood trees, is the route of the Little Bighorn River, and in the valley for 3.5 miles lay the Indian encampment. This is the marker of the General's brother, and also his nephew, Haughty Reed.
'79, primarily to look after and protect the graves of those who died here at the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876. To Colonel George Armstrong Custer and his two brothers, Tom Custer and Boston Custer, a nephew, Haughty Reed, and about a half a mile off to the right is the marker for Lieutenant James Calhoun, George Custer's brother-in-law. So altogether there were 5 members of the Custer family that lost their life here on that Sunday afternoon in 1876. Now we can see the monument on Last Stand Hill off to the right. And that monument does contain the names of all who died here at the battle, including the civilians and the scouts. Now in about 50 minutes we'll be coming back through this area toward the end of the tour. And at that time, if there are any of you that would like to get out at the top of the hill and look at this area more closely and then walk back to the visitor center, please let me know at that time, and I'll certainly take and accommodate that. And of course, for those that want to ride back to the visitor center, we'll certainly do that also. Now off to the right of the van, and later off to the left of the van, you can see markers down in those fields. Well, in the days following the battle, the men that died here were given a rather hasty burial, but the best under the circumstances. And if the name of the trooper was known at that time, it was written down on a piece of paper, and that paper was then rolled up and placed inside of an empty rifle cartridge. Teepees out there this afternoon, and at the time of the battle there were somewhere between 1,000, maybe 1,200 teepees spread out in this valley floor in those 8 individual villages. Now they would not be canvas teepees like we do see out there today. They would be made out of buffalo hides, perhaps other animal hides, but once those hides did bleach out in the sun, they would look very similar to the teepees that we do see out there today. But you'll see a more bright green field very near the interstate. And where that bright green field is where the southernmost village, or the Hunkpapa village of the Sioux, was located. And that is the village where Sitting Bull and his family lived at the time of the battle, and also where the great war leader and war chief Gall and his family lived at the time of the battle, out in that Hunkpapa village.
Stopped in the valley and formed a thin skirmish line when Indians raced out from the village to oppose him. Outflanked, Reno fell back into the timber on his right. Pressure from all directions convinced Reno this position was untenable too, and he retreated after 30 minutes of action. Reno's force was subject to attack by mounted warriors from all quarters. After crossing the river, the remnants of Reno's battered command took up a new position on the bluffs, having suffered over 30 men killed and 13 wounded.
These are the hastily built rifle pits formed by Reno's men on the 25th of June. Looking out, Indians controlled all this ground and kept the cavalry under siege for 2 whole days. After many years of reading about the last stand, I wasn't going to be satisfied with a short bus drive back to the visitor centre. I wanted to appreciate the distances and terrain the troopers had to face that Sunday afternoon. So leaving the bus behind, we set off on a 4.5 mile walk along Battlefield Road.
Some rivers last forever. things, carrying their secrets, summer, winter, fall, and spring. If only you could tell me the things I want to know, but you just keep a moving, traveling oh so slow. Bighorn River, how long will you last? Keeping your secrets hidden from the past, taking them with you is all you can do. I wish you could tell me.
Point. 3.25 miles to go. 3.25 miles to go. It's only 3.25 miles to go. Oh, oh. A horse of the 7th Cavalry. He was born in an open prairie in 1865. 504. Like pony, running wild, running free, till the army came and brought him and took him far away to the stockyards of St. Louis, where he was bound to stay. Decided to a new master he would go, a big strong man, called Miles W.K.O. and Miles was a captain in the 7th Cavalry. On and on.
Comanche rode west from Fort Lincoln with the 7th Cavalry to the big skies of Montana and his place in history. There at the little Bighorn battle, unknown to them all, those brave men of the 7th heard their last bugle call. Comanche, Comanche, brave horse of the 7th Cavalry.
This is the approach to Medicine Tail Coulee, the location that is widely believed to be where Custer attempted to cross the river and attack the Indian village. He was repulsed and forced back onto Battlefield Ridge and the Last Stand. These horses belonged to the Crow Indians who owned the land between the Reno, Benteen and Custer battlefields. I was to discover later that you can hire them to ride this section of the battlefield. That would be an experience to remember. Not that I need an incentive, but there's a good reason to return one day. Sergeant Butler very nearly got away. He is believed to have been a last desperate messenger in an attempt to bring aid. Just when he was about out of range, one last shot brought him down. As we now approach Battlefield Ridge that leads to the Last Stand Hill, white marble markers now appear more frequently on either side of the road. Lieutenant Calhoun, Custer's brother-in-law, swore to the general that if the time ever came, he would never let him down. And from archaeological digs, it seems he kept his word, as Calhoun Hill was the scene of intense and organised defence. 35 years later, and my number one ambition in life is realised. I'm standing on the hill where Custer made his last stand.
On this ridge, a granite pillar stands over the mass grave of soldiers killed in the Battle of the Little Bighorn, June 25th and 26th, 1876. At this site, hundreds of Sioux and Cheyenne warriors defeated 5 cavalry companies of about 220 soldiers under the command of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. As you look over the battlefield, you can see the white markers showing where the bodies of soldiers were found after the fight. No markers show where warriors fell because very little is known of their casualties. Probably less than 100 were killed, and the dead were removed by their families immediately after the battle. Only the Sioux and Cheyenne words tell us what happened to the 220 soldiers killed in the fight. Some Indian accounts say that Custer and his men tried to cross the river 1.5 miles south of here at Medicine Tail Coulee, but angered warriors raced across the river and forced the troops back to the ridges. Having lost the initiative, the soldiers found themselves in rough terrain unsuitable for mounted action. As Gall and other chiefs led their warriors across the river at several places, Custer and his men fought desperately on foot. The warriors did not need to expose themselves to the troopers' fire. Dismounted, they moved from sagebrush to sagebrush and took advantage of the numerous ravines. Finally, Chief Crazy Horse, crossing farther downstream with a large force, swept around this ridge to attack from the north. Here, about 50 soldiers gathered around Custer, shot their horses for breastworks, and fought to the end. The battle lasted 2 hours at most. After the Sioux and Cheyenne had departed, General Terry's column arrived and hastily buried the soldiers where they had fallen. A year later, the remains of 11 officers and 2 civilians were taken for interment elsewhere. Custer was buried at West Point. In 1881, the granite memorial was placed atop the ridge, and the remains of the soldiers were gathered from the field and placed in the mass grave at the base of the stone.
What was it like for those beleaguered troopers at the very end? Would Custer be as well known today had he lived? With that thought in mind, we leave the Little Bighorn battlefield.